Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is such a treat to have you here today. My name is Chris Gordon and I am the Programming Manager for Readings. It is now gives me quite a thrill to introduce you to Ursula and Alison. And of course we know Ursula because she is this year's Australian Children's Laureate. And we know Alison because she was one of the first Australian Children's Laureates. The Australian Children's Laureate is important because it was set up to make to make sense of who reads children's books, why children's books are important, and to celebrate that these authors are giving something much more than words to our young people. They're giving the freedom, they're giving them a license to their imagination. These people that are awarded this have already made significant contributions to the children's literature focus, and I think that if we were all gathered at the Readings Kids Shop, all crowded in on this rainy day, we would actually just applaud the fact that these two women have been writing for our children and for our souls since the beginning of time. At the moment, Ursula is up in Sydney, and you all know that in Sydney there is rain coming down in some sort of time-honoured way. It does make her sound a little bit crackly. She's clear as day, but there'll be a bit of a crackle. And I guess that's just a reminder that at the moment we're living through some sort of reckoning of times. Alison, of course, is up in the country in Victoria. We can see by her beautiful autumn leaves that it's just about to start turning into a new season. And here we are, snug in our own homes, imagining that we're in a children's bookshop, imagining that the shelves are filled with their stories, filled with Ursula and Alison's stories on either side. So I want you to imagine that the applause is almost deafening. It's like the rain coming down on your roof. Yeah, that's what it's like at the moment. And everyone is very excited that you're about to join us at the microphone. To you, my friend.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you for the beautiful welcome. And I'm just really honoured too feeble a word to describe how I feel to be in this position to be talking to Alison Lester this morning with you all. And I'm sure everybody listening is aware of Alison's, very distinguished and generous creative life that and all she's done for children here and around the world. It's just a long and wonderful history of drawing and writing, making books, both on your own and in some quite amazing collaborations, which I hope we talk about in a minute. Before doing the interview, before doing this chat, I thought I'll just see what else Alison has had to say in the past. So I read various interviews and blog posts and all that sort of thing. And you talk about how as a child you drew all the time, but you were clearly also a born writer, because you're this sort of astonishing thing, a writer, illustrator. I mean, very astonishing to me. And I loved the line when you said something like that you're excellent at school at composition. And that struck my eye because that word composition I find so meaningful if I think about my own writing. It's not used anymore in school. You sort of do creative writing. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that word composition in relation to visual art, which we're a bit more used to, but also in relation to how you write. And do they come together for you, those two acts as acts of composition?
Hi, Ursula, and hi, everyone. And thank you so much for interviewing me today. I feel very honoured, so thank you for that. And thanks for everyone for zooming in, and Christine for that beautiful welcome. It's such a funny word, composition, and that's what we called it in those days. But when I look at my work, that's really what it's quite like. Like, so often a book will just start off with a little idea that comes from somewhere. I think the craziest one is a book that I wrote and illustrated called Kissed by the Moon. And Kissed by the Moon was a label on a sweater I had that I loved. I think it's a New Zealand knitwear label. And I remember thinking about that and thinking that would be such a nice name for a book. And then from that, all these little, you must work this way too, that you have that one little kernel and then other little bits come and hop onto it, and you keep it in your head for quite a long time. And then by the time you actually go to put some notes down, it has started to become composed into some kind of order. And for me, I see the images almost at the same time. I see the words for me are there in pictures as well for almost everything that I do. So the visual thing for me is enormous. And my husband always teases me that when we're looking at house plans, I go, oh, yeah, that would look like this, and I have to draw it for him because he can't see something from a plan like that. So I think it's very lucky to be born with that sort of visual brain where you can see things in your head very easily. And then once I start doing the words, they turn from just these few little notes into something a little bit more poetic. And then I invariably write way too much. And then the next process is polishing it back and back and back and back until I can get it as perfect as I can.
I sometimes think, when I think of that word composition in terms of writing, it's almost, and that's very much like what you said about the label on your jumper, but it's like you're just getting these, elements. I'm not gifted at visual art, but I used to love collage, and I sometimes think of writing as a story. To me is a little bit like you've got all these sort of elements on the page, and you're sort of moving them around, kind of you're composing them, I suppose.
Yeah,
those choices, I guess, that you make.
Yeah. And I didn't realise it could do it, but Ros Price, who of course we all know and love, who was the really the first children's editor at publisher at Allen and Unwin in Australia, and who gave me my first break, said to me a while ago, you know what you're really good at? You're really good at fitting a whole lot of people into a picture. She was looking at some pages of the book Sing Me the Summer that I'd illustrated for our mutual friend Jane Godwin, and that is such a composing thing when you've got maybe 8 figures that have got to fit in the page, and they've all got to be sitting and doing something that works for the story as well. So that's quite a composing.
That's fascinating. And that, I'm sure, well, I imagine you feel like that about when you're writing as well, because it is about all those elements that you need to sort of get them all together in a way that has some meaning, I guess, and it's not overwhelming. And it's beautiful.
That look right, that they don't, you think, you're not looking and thinking, why would that kid be sitting like that? That's ridiculous. It has to make sense.
It seems like it was always meant to be, that you just suddenly took a photo and there they were. I mean, in that, another thing, and that authors talk about all the time is, finding a voice, that sort of, until you find that sort of place where you're comfortable writing in the way that you write. And I wonder how that applies to illustrators. I mean, did you have that voice that you have as an illustrator from when you began to draw, or did you kind of discover it?
No, I think it has developed. When I look at my very first illustrations, which were illustrating a book for kindergartens called Big Dipper, which was long, more than 40 years ago, my drawings are so clumsy. Like they didn't have they weren't very charming, and I think I probably always had that sensibility that was my voice, but I actually had to get my drawing skills really honed up until I could express it through a pencil. And having said that, I'm really stuck in one sort of style. I break out every now and again and try and do collage or something different, or use some photographs in my work. But when it comes to drawing faces, I don't seem to be able to get away from just 2 little dots and a nose and a mouth, and anything else looks incredibly weird.
Yes, and that's sort of, but are you saying that particular style was not necessarily there in your very early drawings, but they were there in your mind in a way? Well,
that style was there, but it wasn't finessed. It was too clumsy work. Like it didn't have
the kind of expertise you had to develop.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I became aware of your work. We're a similar sort of age, and I guess we've been writing away, and in your case, drawing and publishing and working at it for a similar, for something like 40 years.
Yeah.
If there are any children listening, they'll be shocked. but I think I was Clive Eat Alligators your first author illustrator book? Is that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly, with my children very aware of that. And they always called it Clive Eats Fried Rice. I just couldn't get them to call it Clive Eats Alligators, but they were always demanding it. And this sort of, from that book, it would seem, that's your first book that you did totally by yourself, and that voice is so, both in illustration and writing, is so assured and confident and perfect. And I guess from that beginning, if we begin there with your work, you created this, or these, actually, they're plural, these beautiful sort of heavenly worlds of childhood, with centering on children's perceptions and fantasies and experiences. And I think it's sort of fascinating how you've brought that sort of almost divine kind of sensibility to lots of very different and sometimes very challenging situations and projects that involve children. And I know you've done some amazing collaborations that we're talking before we opened about Jane Godwin, and you've done collaborations in remote communities, Indigenous communities, at the Children's Hospital. There's your whole amazing Antarctic adventure. And so I'm just interested in how you could talk about some of those things and the continuum with your own early work and perhaps with your own childhood, in what you brought from those early beginnings to these quite different and rather extraordinary projects.
Thank you for all those kind words. I think I did have a really fabulous childhood, living on a farm and having heaps of freedom, having my own horse. I guess I could ride independently by the time I was 5 or 6, and I could just go off on the farm, and I was trusted to do quite responsible jobs. So I lived in a really beautiful little bubble of life on our farm where I could do lots of things and I felt quite powerful, but I also was an incurable romantic and dreamer, so I had a lot of time to daydream. But I think once I became an adult, I wasn't quite sure how to put that part of myself out into the world, and it probably wasn't until I had my own children that it all clicked back into place again. So without sounding dramatic, those years between when I grew up and when I had my own children, I was really looking for something and not quite sure where I fitted. But then once I had my own kids, it all seemed to snap back into place, and I just loved being in that world where the kids were the centre of their own universes and they could do anything and go anywhere, and their moments were so tender and beautiful and their fears were so real. So to be able to, I guess to be lucky enough to have fabulous editors like Ros Price who could say, and Rita Hart who would say, yeah, this is great, do it, where I think a lot of, and I spoke to this with Rita a while ago, I said to her, I can't believe we got Clive Eats Alligators published. It doesn't seem very obvious. And she said, yeah, they laughed at me in the meeting. All the men who were in charge said, oh, this is, it's not really a book. Because it's not really a story, it's just looking at these kids' lives. So I really am so grateful for having those strong women to work alongside who actually helped me get my work out there. And then once it got out there, it worked, obviously, so they were happy to let me go with it. But
what an interesting sort of, that's just so interesting, isn't it, about that whole idea of what a book is and what a story is. And I was actually reading some very interesting thing about somebody talking about, stories having a narrative arc, blah, blah, but what if we base stories on the spirals of nature instead of this idea of, Aristotle or what, this sort of idea that this is what a story is, and if it doesn't have that, no, it doesn't work. Whereas in fact, yes, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's fascinating.
Oh, no, please interrupt, because it triggers me, to think about things too. And I really agree with that. And I think Clive Eats Alligator, to me, it always felt very much like a photo album. There were just the images with little captions below them. And for someone who'd never written a book, that was a great way to start because there were so few words. And I've worked with it with kids in schools all around Australia, and the framework is lovely to use with kids because they can put themselves into those stories. You can give them a task of saying, what did you do when you were 1? Find out something you did when you were 2, and, what's your favourite cereal and what's your pet called? And I think so often little kids kind of grow up in a little bit of a fog, not knowing quite what's going on. So if they can have a little dossier about themselves that is their identity, it really helps them feel strong. But going back to, oh no, you go on.
Oh no, I was simply going to say just very briefly, when you said so few words, to me that's the mark of someone who's a great writer, because most new writers write far too many words, don't they?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Whereas that's an instinct of a great writer. Anyway, please go on.
And and people have in reviews of the Quicksand Pony said it's a shame she's so brief about everything that I should write more. But it's always my instinct to just hone it down until, I guess that's from doing picture books. And then I've been so lucky as I've got older and my work has become, more out there in the world. It's felt so fortunate to be able to have these community involvements, where I work with people in remote communities making books and have the chance to go to the Royal Children's Hospital and Antarctica. And I have to always hold myself back because I'm terribly bossy and a bit of a control freak. So when I'm working, I have to, and people sometimes say, just back off, Alison, but just to have all the art supplies and to help kids see that, what they're doing is absolutely brilliant and help that project through to something finished is really, really exciting and rewarding.
And just not exactly an aside, but it's also one of your, I suppose, in getting out there into the community was it's unusual for 2 Australian children's laureates to be talking to each other, and you, of course, with Buri Pryor, were the very first Australian children's laureate about 6 or 7 years ago, something like that, was it?
Yeah. 2012 and 2013,
right.
I think.
Oh, so nearly, so getting on for 9 years. And I just wonder if you'd like to talk a little about that now that the years have passed, what things were perhaps strongest in your mind, remain strongest in your mind from that, and also if you've got any tips or hints for the current incumbent.
Yeah, well, I remember when they asked me if I would do it, I was so honoured, but I also had this feeling of terror that swept over me that I would do something really embarrassing while I was laureate and it would just be terrible. And I really kept thinking about how much my mum and dad would have been so thrilled to see me do it. So it was an honour to take it on, and it was really beautiful to be able to do it with Buri, who's an Indigenous man from North Queensland. So I felt it was a really nice pairing of 2 people. And I think probably because we were the first ones, we did so much, like we just travelled all over the country, which we both do a fair bit of anyway. And we both work a lot with little kids, so that was really enjoyable. We went to China and we went to Bologna and we went to Italy, so it was quite a glamorous kind of thing. I felt like there was a lot going on. And it was just beautiful being around the country and just meeting librarians and teachers and parents and kids who are all crazy about books. And you have probably come across this too, but at the end, I kind of felt like I wished I'd been able to engage more, that I was preaching to the converted, that I hardly ever got to talk to kids who didn't have books in their lives, and that they were the families that I would really have liked to got hold of. And in fact, I had the great pleasure or the great privilege of meeting Dolly Parton when she was out here last time.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, she has her wonderful imagination library, and it's in Australia now. And one of my books was the first book that was gifted, so I got invited along to meet her, which was really fabulous. But I think that's a fabulous program because I think kids register through some sort of, if they're involved, if their families are involved in if they need help, the kids can sign up then. And once they're signed up, they get a book sent to them every month until they turn 6. So there's often households that have had no books in them have this book arriving for this special child every month, which is just a fabulous thing.
And I think that the fact it comes every month is sort of important, isn't it? Because if it was just one book that appeared once,
it wouldn't matter.
But it's that regularity, I guess, that because I think if you're not sort of naturally bookish or you grow up in a place where there's no natural attachment to books, it is a slow process, isn't it, discovering
Oh, so hard. Like
Uh,
so many kids wouldn't even hold a book until they go
No.
to school, you know,
No,
and that's
but-
why it's really so important to do this thing that I think, I don't know who's talking about, maybe Anthony Albanese was saying the other day that, no, it wasn't him, anyway, that we really need universal preschool for kids, you know, that every child in Australia needs to be able to go to preschool so that when they go to school, they're ready to learn, you know, that they're not so far behind the eight ball that they'll never catch up. What have you found the most interesting and worthwhile thing to
Look, I think because I'm in the middle of it, Alison, it's kind of hard to tell. It's a helter-skelter jumping from one thing to another. But I think we're all very aware of what you are saying, that it's not as though anybody in Australia is what you would call against books. You know, everybody thinks, oh, yeah, books are good. But it's about actually creating opportunities, but you become a reader not by accident but by opportunity. And if there are
it's kind of about social change, isn't it? It's about looking after our people who need looking after better, you know, people who are socially disadvantaged.
That's right. And certainly having no access to books is a social disadvantage of a pretty fundamental kind. Yeah. Well, look, watching the time, I wonder if we could move on to the subject of horses. Now, like everybody, I adore and worship horses, but probably like most people, I'm frightened of them as well. Although, you know, as a child, I, like so many children, fantasized and dreamed about riding horses. So I loved horse books, but the reality of the big teeth and the big hooves was all a bit too much for me. But anyway, a few years ago, I was at Bologna, talking of Bologna. Bologna is where they have a big annual children's book fair. It's fantastic. And there are open days for the public. So if you ever happen to be in Italy at the time, I would recommend it if you want to see a lot of books in one place. Anyway, in this great thousands and thousands of books, I remember seeing a French children's picture book with the title The Woman Who Loved Horses Too Much. I would like to ask you if this is even possible as a concept, and perhaps you could talk to us a bit about your life with horses, both, you know, in your own life, as you mentioned, from childhood and your adult life, and also the, you know, beautiful, stunning books that have featured horses. And we're hoping that you might be tempted to read a little bit and tell us a little bit about the genesis and your very beautiful novel. Oh, here it is. The Quicksand Pony. So horses, Alison.
All right. Thanks, Ursula. Well, I think all the women who do love horses too much wouldn't think they do, but their families probably think they do, because it's, my husband always growls at me because whenever we come home, before I come in the house, I always race up the hill to see the horses. And he's like, I don't believe you always do that, you know, but that's how it is. And I don't think the horsey people can control themselves. I think you're just born that way, that you love horses or not. And some people like me are born into families where there's just horses around you from the word go. But I often meet people who, and especially when I'm signing books, little kids who are just crazy about horses, who don't have a horse in their family and go to all sorts of lengths so they can get themselves to pony club or to riding school or somewhere, and they become horsey people. So I think it's some genetic thing that hasn't been identified yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was lucky enough to grow up on a farm in South Gippsland down near Wilson's Promontory. So it was a cattle farm, so we always had horses. And I got my own horse, Inky, for Christmas when I was 5. So it was a very exciting Christmas. And I'm the youngest of 4. And my brothers and sisters always say, we can't believe you were so easy to trick, that apparently the pony had arrived weeks before Christmas and had been kept in a back paddock and I wasn't allowed down there. And I remember on the Christmas Eve, we used to put a pillowcase out for our presents. And this Christmas, I thought, I'm going to put 2 pillowcases out and I might get a lot of stuff, being a bit greedy. Anyway, when I woke up in the morning, both the pillowcases were empty and I went into Mum and Dad's room sobbing, you know, that Santa had punished me for being so guilty at that age. Santa had punished me for being greedy, so I'd got nothing. Anyway, Mum said, go back and have another look. There might be something very tiny in there. So I went and felt, and sure enough, there was a little bit of paper that said, dear Alison, go and look in the stockyards, love from Santa. So my sister and I raced up to the cattle yards in our pajamas, and there was Inky, who was a very saggy old black Shetland pony who we absolutely loved. Yeah. So that was my first horse.
Obviously had your kind of I don't know if it's your mother or father or who, but that's such a sort of beautifully, magically sensitive way to make a most amazingly memorable event and meaningful event in the life of their daughter. I mean,
it is nice, rather than just saying the horse arriving and say, this is your Christmas
pony, stop your whinging. Yeah.
Well, they were both very practical people, but they both did love a bit of romance and dreaminess too. So I think that's where it came from. Before that, I used to just use whatever horse was going. So all the horses were pretty quiet. And even before that, if Dad was riding past the house, Mum would take me out with a cushion from the lounge room and past me in the cushion. He'd put the cushion on the pommel of his saddle and I'd go off with him to do the stock work. So, yeah, I have memories. I must have only...
Right.
Oh, go on.
I just want to very quickly say, have you ever read the opening chapters of Martin Boyd's novel, A Difficult Young Man? Because it's all...
But I have
to... Tamerlane or Tourmaline.
Yeah. Did he have a similar upbringing?
Well, it's just like the passionate relationship. Look, from memory, it's a little bit on the tragic side, but it's just from the point of view of the child and his pony, and it's so beautiful. I just recommend it to everybody. Martin Boyd. It would have been published maybe 50, 60, 70.
I think I've got it here. Yeah.
Yeah. Read it. It's so good. Anyway, that was just an aside.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was sitting on a horse with my dad when I was a baby, so since then, I've really never not had a horse. Like I've always had a horse. I've got my own horse here now and a couple of ponies for the grandkids. So it's just part of life. Some people always have a cat or a dog, and I always have a cat and a dog as well. Loving animals so much, and I think we love horses because really it's an incredible thing that there's this big animal that will allow you to get around on it, so that you can go off and have adventures together. And there's plenty of horses that do the wrong thing. But if you have a horse who loves you and you love and you get on well, you really trust them and you have a beautiful time together. I had a lovely horse. He died the year before last when he was 36 years old, which is very old for a big horse. He was a big giant horse called Woollyfoot, and he was really just so kind to me. We had a wonderful time together. So, yeah, so it's just natural that I write for them, I think. And the Quicksand Pony is based on, I'll see if I can hold this up so I show you. Oh, maybe it's not in this one. This is what the cover used to look like. I could only find a foreign language edition, isn't that beautiful? It's a beautiful photograph that I took of a friend of ours pretending to be the little boy in the story. I took it by firelight, and the pony had to be so close to the fire that little sparks were getting stuck in his mane, and we were having to put the little fires out that were taking off. But here is this is Taffy.
Oh.
This is a picture of my dad. Can you see it?
Yeah.
This is my dad and my two sisters and my cousin on Taffy. And he was the horse who did get bogged in quicksand on the beach. So he was the horse that inspired the Quicksand Pony. And I can remember when it happened, my dad and his brother used to put cattle out onto Wilson's Promontory, which is now a big, beautiful national park that pokes down into Bass Strait at the bottom of Victoria. But in those days, they used to lease it to run cattle on. And this year, I must have been about 6 years old. I was always too little to go on the musters, but we used to go and meet them on the day they were due back. We knew they'd be back in the afternoon, and we'd ride up to the end of our road. And this day we went up on our ponies, my sisters and I. Maybe my brother was actually out on the muster. And we waited and waited, and they just never came. So we finally went home when it started to get dark, and we could see that Mum was really worried too. And finally we heard dogs barking, and we knew they were back. And when my father walked into the kitchen, we could see by the look on his face that something really terrible had happened. And he told us that Taffy, that lovely horse I just showed you, had got bogged in quicksand on the beach, and that they'd tried to get him out. The fellow who was riding him had managed to get out, but they tried to tow him out with another horse, and they tried to dig him out, and they finally just had to get the saddle off him and leave him there because the tide was coming in. And they had a mob of about 300 cattle on the beach, and there was no way of getting them off. They had to keep going. So when Dad told us this, we were just hysterical with sadness that poor Taffy's stuck there on the beach with the tide coming in. And Dad said to us, look, you know, there's still hope that he'll be okay, you know. But we all went to bed sobbing. And in the morning, we got up and Mum and Dad were still asleep, and we went down to the kitchen, and my brother went across to the sink for something and looked out the window, and there was Taffy at our garden fence. So he'd struggled out of the quicksand when the tide came in and come home 25 kilometres by himself in the dark. Just such a lovely story. But yeah, that's the start of the Quicksand Pony.
So, such an extremely beautiful book, which can only be completely and utterly recommended. Do you feel like you want to read a bit?
Yeah, I will read a bit. I'll read the start. I looked at different things, and everything I read seemed to give away the story too much. So the story that I just told you about Taffy, it's like that composition, you know, that was the start, and I've added little bits to it. So there's another character in the story now, and this is the start. This start of the story.
I'll just very briefly say that is such a sort of almost disturbingly moving story about Taffy, that you can see that something like that just would be in your heart, you know, for years and years and years. And it's unsurprising that in a way it transforms itself into such a moving and beautiful book.
I think
it must have just been at any age an extraordinary witnessing of some sort of spirit of something.
Yeah, that it happened. And I always say that to kids when I'm talking about writing, like we've all got those family stories. They mightn't be a big heroic story like Taffy, but there's a story that is your story, and it's truth. Yeah. So here there's a little map in the book, which is kind of so you can see what's happened. So there's the bay, and here's the headland. So here we go. This chapter is called The Disappearance. The moon was full the night they disappeared. Windswept paddocks lay clear and blue under high tatters of cloud. A car lurched without lights along the rutted road that ran from the town to the bay. It moved erratically, urgently, as though the driver didn't know how to drive. The wind whipped away the sound of the engine. At the landing, the car bumped to a stop, and a slim figure emerged. She moved quickly, ferrying her bags and boxes into a dinghy moored at the rickety bush jetty. Finally, satisfied that the oars and gears were right, she returned to the car and lifted out another bundle, which she carried with great tenderness to the boat. She stowed it carefully in the bow, away from the wind and spray, then slipped into the boat like a cat and rode silently out with the swirling tide. The boat moved out across the bay, through the shadows of scudding clouds. The tide was rushing out, rushing towards the entrance of the bay and beyond to the wild open sea. She had to row across the current to reach the headland on the other side. She settled into a steady rhythm of rowing. If she kept the lights of the town lined up with the top of Price's Hill, she'd be on the right line. The waves slapped against the side of the boat, uneven and choppy. It became more difficult to row. Her right oar missed the water altogether as the dinghy pitched and sent her sprawling backwards. She was drenched with spray, and there were hours of rowing to go. Oh, for a bit of flat water. It was a desperate struggle. If she rested for a moment, the tide snatched the boat and dragged it towards the entrance. It was hard to tell how long she'd been rowing. She twisted on the wooden seat to look at the headland. She wasn't even halfway, but she was already tired, and her hands were blistered from the rough wooden oars. I'm never going to make it, she thought. It's too hard with the wind and tide against me. Everything was always against her. She rested the oars on her knees and dropped her head in despair, then looked up as she felt the boat shift against the tide. That east wind, the easterly they always cursed for bad weather it brought, had come to her help. It swung around from the southwest, gusting and ruffling the water, and pushed the dinghy towards the mountains. It was going to be all right. Her hands weren't so sore. Her chest didn't feel as if it was about to burst anymore. She could do it. She lifted the edge of the tarpaulin in the bow and listened intently, not a sound. She smiled and began to row again. The lights of the town became smaller and smaller. Across the silver water on her left, her port side, she thought, the farms that lay between the town and the headland were in darkness. Everyone would have been in bed long ago. Some of the dairy farmers would be probably getting up soon to milk their cows. The boat inched across the bay, its wake fanning out behind. She was mesmerised by the moving water. Images flicked through her mind. She thought of everything. She thought of nothing. She kept on rowing. One of the oars banged against the side of the boat and she grabbed it with a start. Had she been asleep or just dreaming? She looked over her shoulder. There was the beach, Whiting Beach. She was almost there. The girl gave one last pull on the oars to ground the boat in the shallows, then lay back against the seat, breathing in ragged gasps. Her baby started to cry. She fished him out of his blanket, held him to her breast and fed him. As he nursed, she listened to the waves lapping on the sheltered shore and knew she had come home. Far across the moonlit bay, the lights of the town were no more than a sparkling chain. She was never going back. Do you want me to read more? Is that enough?
I think my message from Christine is is that right, Christine, that you would like us perhaps to stop now, but that was just
right.
about talking of mesmerising. That was a mesmerising and beautiful reading. I just struck me there that had an element of that, well, more than an element, but that very strange and evocative beauty of the paintings of Clarice Beckett, you know, the sort of...
Oh, thank you so much for saying that.
Just beautiful, moving, mysterious, sort of wonderful. That line, she thought of everything, she thought of nothing, she kept on rowing. It's just really beautiful.
Thank you, Ursula. And I absolutely love her work. And a couple of years ago, the Women and Children's Hospital in Canberra put some images of Kissed by the Moon as big wallpapers up in their passages. And the art director who organised it said, you know, Clarice Beckett was one of the few people who could capture that soft purple light of Southern Australia. And so, yeah, that's a very beautiful compliment. Thank you.
Well, Christine, will I hand it over to you?
You will. You're
for this conversation.
What I'm actually imagining is that the two of you come together every year and just reflect on your writing. Listening to you talk has made me create 101 stories in my own head, just bouncing off some of the words that you've said. I imagine it's like that for many people that have been fortunate enough to hear you both this morning. I do want to point at a little friend that I've set up just behind me just to let you know.
Look at that.
That here at Readings we are also enormous fans.
Oh, Dolly
Parton.
And I've got that book too. It's such a fabulous book, yeah.
It's so good, isn't there? So many quotable quotes.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
She really is. But to be honest, not as wonderful as you are, Alison Lester, and you.
Stop that.
You two have just given Australia so much. And on behalf of Australia, thank you. Thank you for coming to us today on this Sunday morning. Thank you for battling the rain, Ursula, to bring us the internet, to you to bring us some autumn leaves, Alison. It's such a pleasure and such an inspiration to hear both of you. Thank you. And
thanks, Chris.
Enjoy your beautiful days.
Yeah.
Go and see those horses.
Thanks, Ursula, too.
Thank you, Alison. Great conversation. Really beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you for making it so easy.
Well, I hope the crackling was okay. So
the crackling disappeared, or I just stopped hearing.
Right, we got used to it.
It did disappear.
I asked my husband not to make any noise, and he was outside mowing the lawn, so I was like, So I hope that wasn't.
But that was just such a beautiful conversation. Really, thank you so much. It was what a great way to start the day. So
I did that slightly awkward blurby bit about Anthony Albanese in the middle. So hopefully, Christine, you can chop that out. I'm not sure.
I can.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Sounds like
everyone.
a good idea. Universal preschool to me. You know.
Oh, it is a good idea. Yeah, it's a no-brainer.
I'm going to end it now.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Christine. Right. Thanks, Ursula. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.